give me your thoughts on coronavirus, because again, originally we saw the predictions from Imperial College and the computer models of 2 million people dying in the US. And then we saw those numbers come way down, but we still see, especially in the media these days, that I sometimes I can just see that the articles, they're getting crazy clicks because the second wave, it's gets people scared again. But what is the reality of what we've actually seen with COVID-19 versus what people are being told by governments and what we expected?
The science is so multifaceted here, and to say that I have all this science at my fingertips would be inaccurate in that I have a lot of numbers that I've pulled and have colleagues that have been pulling aggressively for months now to come up with a stable model for what's been happening around the world. And it certainly is telling a different tale than we're seeing in the media. But it's not to say that people aren't dying. It is actually to say that people are dying, and people are dying related to an exposure to a respiratory virus. There's huge problems with our diagnostic tool here. PCR is the tool that's been used globally to determine if somebody has COVID or not. And PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. It's an amplification technique for finding small amounts of DNA. It is a very big dilemma because the presence of that DNA doesn't mean you're ever going to get sick from that virus. Most of us will have that DNA in our bloodstream for a period of time as we go into our genetic update. As we're taking this virus in, we proliferate the virus to get it into enough cells in the body, and then we reach homeostasis where we've taken in enough of that genetic information that we stop making it. And so, or we make tiny amounts of it. And so that balance with that DNA has nothing to do with whether we're going to develop disease or not. Again, most people exposed to COVID were asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. And so the presence of the DNA has nothing to do with whether that person is going to die in the coming months. That's fallacy number one. The next problem is you have no idea who had COVID in their bloodstream 2 weeks ago. All you can say is it's there or not there right now. And that's a problem because you don't know at the rate at which people are naturally recovering from the exposure of this or adapting to the exposure of this virus. And therefore, you get this very artificial look at who's dying or the mortality rate of this thing because you're only looking at in sick populations. And if you only look in sick populations, you're going to find an abnormal amount of this virus presence, just as if you go to a farm that has destroyed soil, you're going to find all kinds of microorganisms that are abnormally represented there because the soil is destroyed. And so we're going into damaged soil patients and saying, oh my gosh, the virus is here. And the answer is, of course it's there because they don't have a normal ecosystem. They don't have a normal biologic balance, homeostasis with their environment. And anything in the environment is going to be present in abnormal ratios, especially if they're on a statin drug and ACE inhibitor that pulled that virus in from the environment at a more aggressive effort. And so we keep mistaking the presence of this virus as if it's a causative agent. And we know that it's not because it didn't hurt most of the people that were exposed to it. And so to say that this virus is attacking somebody is just categorically wrong by the science that's sitting right in front of us. A deeper flaw is that PCR has an extraordinary amount of false positives. And so every time we say that here's a new corona case, the likelihood of that being COVID is a fraction of the reality or our stated reality. And so one study that got done early on and was immediately ripped off within weeks was that there was a false positive rate of 80% with the current PCR tests that came out at the beginning of this pandemic. And 80% false positive means that you are overestimating the number of infections by 80%. And so even if you are identifying the DNA within that patient, the likelihood that you're finding COVID there is actually very, very low. And the actual number was like 19.8%. As that got pulled off, the other half of the study had said that it also has a false negative rate of 30%, meaning that when you say, no, there's no DNA in here, 30% of those people actually do have the DNA there. And so it neither is good at doing, predictive presence or the elimination of the likelihood of that thing going there. What got left behind in that study, so they ripped off the data saying that there was this 80% false positive rate and left the data that there was a 30% false negative rate so that they could go on with the media saying, not only we have 200,000 deaths in America from COVID, we probably are underestimating that by 30% or so. So what we are seeing in the media is this whole story of we have this really abnormal rate of total death. Total mortality is really high around the world between these months where we said COVID is here. And so by doing that, we gave the impression that we had this extreme mortality, this very dangerous virus. But the diagrams they keep showing you is just last year compared to this year. And if you look at the 7-year trend of all-cause mortality, it's been steadily going up. But if you age adjust that all-cause mortality, it's going up very slowly. The reality is we have an aging population, and with every time that the age of the population ticks up, you expect more mortality that year because people have an expiration date that's predictable, especially when the planet gets more and more toxic and the chance of living gets less and less. And so when you correct for the general trend over the last 7 years of mortality, we're actually spot on our total mortality for the year in the United States here. And so we didn't have some explosive year of death. We are on track for our natural progression that if you adjust for age and then adjust for population growth, we're spot on. It's for the data that you're currently seeing that makes it look so out of whack compared to last year is notable, that because when you look at the last 7-year trend, we had a very bizarrely low mortality rate last year. 2018 to 2019 kind of season was a bizarrely low total mortality as well as respiratory mortality year. And so we are in a catch-up year after that population that should have died last year from respiratory or all-cause mortality, heart attacks, strokes, etc., had low mortality. And so we expect a catch-up year where there's going to be more death from cardiovascular and cancer and everything else because of the pent-up, aging demand that didn't happen to die last year. The baby boomers, as we call them in the United States, are hitting this critical age, 65 and above now. And we're going to see an explosion of all-cause mortality. And so over the next few years, if we let the media tell us what's happening, it's going to sound like we're all at high risk of dying every year. And in some ways they're right, because we're going extinct. But if you age adjust everything, you get a much different look at the reality of where we're at. And so as a consumer, we have to become statisticians at this time, because the statistics are being used against us. It's being used to fuel a fear paradigm within us that is taking away our power. If I come to you as a physician and say, all-cause mortality is increasing because the aging of the population is becoming real. The baby boomers are here. We're going to have the largest geriatric population in the history of mankind, and it's going to be crippled with the worst chronic disease burden that any geriatric population has had, and it's going to happen simultaneous to the most explosive chronic disease burden in children that we've ever seen. And so we are about to see the bankruptcy of Western civilization because of the rise of chronic disease in our children and elderly and the rapid aging of the population as a whole. Now I'm painting you a much different picture that we can actually act on. Okay, how do we now fundamentally change the resources for elderly and children so they don't present with the same burden of chronic disease? And the answer is quite simple. We need to get them outside in the sunshine as much as possible and eating real food all of the time. And if we did those two things, we would fundamentally change the disease burden in the short run. I think there's people out there that say, well, that would be a disaster. Then there's going to be so many more people on the earth. We need people to be dying at the same rate. And I would argue there's a simple solution for population control, and it's called education. Specifically, it's called education of women. Every time we see women's rate of education go up in a society, the size of the family shrinks to a really nice homeostasis and balance. We don't know what the right number of humans are on the earth because we have not educated women. If we educate women globally, we are going to see a balance of our species with our environment for the very first time. And that will be the rise of this feminine archetype that I think will save the planet. If we allow women to start to participate in the design, the fabric of culture, technology, sciences, and certainly medicine, not as pseudo men, because that's what we do right now to women. Like, oh, sure, you can enter the workforce, but you're going to have to behave like the men if you want to play in the boardroom. That's not helpful. That's not creating a feminine archetype. And so we shouldn't be pleased with ourselves if 15% of CEOs are now women. It's such a low number anyways, but we shouldn't even consider that a victory because we've forced them into a masculine archetype. And certainly that happens in medicine all the time. If you're not the toughest, gynecologic surgeon with this badass, kind of do or die mentality, then you're not a good surgeon. And so, the most intense surgeons I was tended to be around in medical school and otherwise were women who were surgeons in gynecologic cancers. They had been forced into adopting this masculine, warlike mentality that they were just scary to be around. That med students were scared to be around them, let alone their patients. And so I see the fact that we are forcing women to lose their most important attributes of process-oriented, nurture-oriented mindset. And so we see the collapse of society happening. I went down a rabbit hole there, and I apologize because you asked us something completely different, I'm sure.
No,
the reality is that I see the opportunity for us to change the fabric by which we see physiology happening on the planet through education, and we'll literally see the balancing of our ecosystem of humans versus soil versus water and air.